With the election of 1980, a major shift in American politics began. It had been building before that, but it is known as the Reagan Revolution because with the victory of Ronald Reagan in 1980 and his re-election in 1984, the nature of American politics changed dramatically, and we're still living with the consequences of the Reagan Revolution. Ronald Reagan was known to Americans as a Hollywood actor, as a television personality. He hosted a program called Death Valley Days. But in 1964, he gave a very influential speech called A Time for Choosing in support of Barry Goldwater, the Republican candidate for president. Now, Goldwater lost in a landslide to Lyndon Johnson, but Reagan sort of became the star of that campaign. 2 years later, he ran successfully for governor of California. And he served in that position for 2 terms, for 8 years. Reagan's attitude toward government was a radical shift from what you would have seen from Lyndon Johnson or from Franklin Roosevelt before him and from most other presidents in that era. In his first inaugural address in 1981, Reagan said, "Government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem." And you see a lot of anti-government sentiment today. Now, this was a challenge to a more liberal approach to government's role. I think the best brief description of that approach comes from Representative Barney Frank, a former member of Congress. He said, or I'm paraphrasing here, government is simply the name we give to the things we choose to do together. So what should we do together? Should it be protecting the welfare of our people? Should it be health care? Should it be protecting the environment? A lot of people say, yes, those are things we need to do together. But those who oppose them say government is getting too big, government is the problem. That's the basic split in American politics ever since Ronald Reagan's election. Now, his approach to the economy, to economics, was known as Reagonomics. He believed in something called supply-side economics. You cut taxes on the theory that this will increase the supply of money available for investment, and this will stimulate economic growth and generate even more tax revenue because of the prosperity that it creates. Now, I should mention that it didn't work this way. He did cut taxes, but budget deficits rose dramatically in the Reagan years. And the supply-side economics has not lived up to its potential since then. Now, the opposite of that could be called demand-side economics or Keynesian economics, after the prominent British economist by the name of John Maynard Keynes. And this approach is spend money to stimulate the economy. Government spending is not necessarily a bad thing because it puts money into the pockets of people, and it creates demand for goods. And that demand for goods causes people to buy things, and that creates jobs and therefore boosts the economy. It's really an opposite approach to supply-side economics. Now, the best example of demand-side economics is World War II. World War II, of course, is not remembered mainly as an economic stimulus, but it was that. There was no question of, well, we've got to save money or cut taxes because we don't really want to defeat Germany and Japan. We just want to go half-heartedly at that project. That would have been ridiculous at the time. We had to just say, whatever it costs, we just have to do it. We have to go for it. And a lot of people thought that after the war there would be runaway inflation, there would be a return to the Depression perhaps, but those things didn't happen. After the war, there was about 25 years of sustained economic growth, the longest period of a healthy economy in American history. So this would be an argument for Keynesian economics. The debate is much more complicated than that, but that is an introduction to it, and you need to understand these two terms. Now, another important feature of Reagan's presidency was the war on drugs. Richard Nixon previously had pursued a war on drugs, and Reagan continued it. And in the process, penalties for the sale of drugs or possession of drugs went up dramatically. You had people who were sentenced to years in prison for possession of marijuana, for example. And the number of incarcerated Americans went up by a great deal. That has been a trend throughout both Democratic and Republican presidencies. It was true under Richard Nixon. It was true under Ronald Reagan. It was also true under the Democrat Bill Clinton. The First Lady, Nancy Reagan, was asked about how to be free of drug use, and she said, just say no, and that became the basis for an anti-drug campaign. Now, one of the problems with this is that crack cocaine came into existence in this period, but some sentences for the sale or possession of crack cocaine were 100 times greater than for powder cocaine. The problem with this is that crack cocaine is cheaper, and it was favored by a lot of minority members. And that meant that there was a racial disparity in the drug enforcement. If you were wealthy from the suburbs, you used powder cocaine, you were dealt with a lot more mildly than if you used crack cocaine. And as I said, the number of imprisoned Americans continued under both Republican and Democratic presidents. Along with this, economic inequality, for a number of reasons, has grown dramatically since the 1980s. The rich have gotten richer, the poor have gotten poorer. It's incredibly disruptive to lock people up, disruptive not only to that individual, but to that person's family as well. But there were other factors involved in economic inequality: the loss of manufacturing jobs, the decline in the power of labor unions, the inability of the federal government to raise the minimum wage to keep up with inflation. And there are, it's a complicated question, but you should know that economic inequality has grown a great deal since the age of Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. Now, one of the initiatives that Reagan undertook was to cut the safety net. The safety net means that if you are really in trouble, the government will be there to help you out and give you at least a minimum degree of economic stability. This is a concept that we understand well now in the age of COVID-19. But Reagan reduced spending on programs that could be lumped together as welfare. That's actually a lot of different programs. He cut welfare, he cut food stamps, he cut Medicaid, medical care for the poor. He cut Social Security, which is protection for the elderly. He cut education funds. He cut nutritional assistance for children. And he justified those moves with the statement, I believe the best social program is a job. But those jobs often did not pay enough to provide a living wage to the people who held them. He was hostile also to unemployment insurance, an issue that exists today now that we have such massive numbers of unemployed as a result of COVID-19. But he said unemployment insurance is a prepaid vacation for freeloaders. This takes us back to the old Calvinist idea, going way back to the 17th century, that people can be divided into two groups, and that one's material prosperity is somehow a sign of that person's virtue. So there has long been in American culture a distrust and dislike for people who are not economically successful, and that is reflected in this statement. And as I said, these beliefs and the role of government in general are being challenged by the pandemic that we're undergoing right now. Now, the other aspect of Reagan's presidency that I really want to emphasize is the end of the Cold War. And let's start the story here. In 1985, the Soviet Union got a new leader by the name of Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev changed the system in the Soviet Union radically through the application of two principles. In Russian, they're called Glasnost and Perestroika. Now, we'll look at each one in just a bit. But in response to the difficulties the Soviet Union was having, Reagan raised military spending dramatically during this period. He also initiated what was called the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI. It was nicknamed Star Wars over a popular movie that came out in the late 70s. And of course, we're still living with Star Wars today, its sequels. Reagan gave a famous speech in Berlin in 1987. He said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall," meaning the Berlin Wall, which was symbolically the separation between the capitalist West and the communist East. If you go to the PDF version of this, you can click on this link and watch it. There was also a continuing debate over whether Reagan ended the Cold War or lengthened it. Was his increased military spending, for example, and his threat of being able to shoot down enemy missiles at the end of the Cold War, did the Strategic Defense Initiative, for example, convince the Soviets that they would have to build more and more and more missiles, and they simply couldn't afford to do it? Or were there other reasons for this? That is a debate that continues among historians today. Okay, now let's look at those two principles that Gorbachev initiated. One is Glasnost. It literally means an opening. It included freedom of speech, which didn't exist in the Soviet Union before that. Intellectuals who had left the country, when people who leave their country to go live in another country are known as expatriates or expats. And they were allowed to return without any penalty to the Soviet Union. There was a freer press there. And these were things that were unheard of under former Soviet leaders. The government admitted the crimes that it had committed, admitted its mistakes. For example, the nuclear accident at Chernobyl. And the history itself was rewritten. It had been written by Soviet historians who presented it entirely from the standpoint of the Soviet Union. But at this point, history becomes more honest. They're looking at their own history. Opposition parties were now legal. Now, these changes have not entirely survived under Vladimir Putin. They were in existence under Gorbachev and his successor Boris Yeltsin, but Putin has scaled back a lot of these freedoms. Okay, the other principle that Gorbachev put forward was perestroika, and literally that means restructuring. So as far as industry went, there were no more government subsidies of food, of housing, of education, and healthcare, etc. And in that sense, it's a little bit like what Ronald Reagan was doing in the United States. People had to pay higher prices for necessities. Uh, a lot of state-owned factories were closed or restructured. Um, there was a very corrupt system that existed in the Soviet Union where there was a lot of bribery, that people advanced their careers by pleasing what their bosses wanted, even if that didn't actually make the economy more productive. And Gorbachev saw all this, and he took action to change it. In agriculture, the system that came into being under Stalin especially was that you would have large collective farms, state-owned farms, where people would work on those farms. But Gorbachev reversed a lot of this. He said state farms could be leased to private individuals and private groups. There was an end to central planning, where there are decisions made in Moscow about how much should be produced and where and how. Government no longer kept food prices low. It allowed the free market to determine them. And this resulted in a lot of pain for the Soviet Union. But Gorbachev believed that it was necessary to make these changes to make things better in the long run. Okay, now in the process in 1991, at the end of 1991, the Soviet Union fell apart. It had been a collection of 15 separate republics, such as Ukraine was one, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Kazakhstan, etc. And all of these now are independent countries. They are 15 separate countries. What remains is Russia, officially known as the Russian Federation. And the Soviet Union completely came to an end at the end of 1991. And that completed the end of the Cold War. And the debate remains over exactly why the Cold War ended. I've already talked about the role that some historians believe Ronald Reagan had in that. The other interpretation is that the Soviet system was just unsustainable. It had such severe economic problems that it had to change. And when Reagan ramped up the pressure, that actually gave more power to the hardliners, the traditionalists in the Soviet Union, and delayed the collapse of the Soviet Union. Those are two interpretations that are still, as I said, debated until the present day.